show you the anatomy of the sewing machine, and what that means is just the basic parts of the sewing machine. But before that, it's very important for you to know a little bit about how a sewing machine works, and that will make more sense as we go along with the anatomy. First of all, there's two threads in a sewing machine. There's going to be one thread that is on the top, and that looks like this. That's the spool of thread that you're going to buy or you're going to have for sewing. And the other one is called the bobbin thread, and that's a thread that goes on the bottom inside of the sewing machine. And what the machine does is really remarkable. It takes the upper thread and it loops it around the lower thread and pulls it back up, and that is actually what makes the stitches that hold the fabric together when you sew. So it's just important to know that you have those two different types of threads. The other thing that is important to know is that this machine, as you thread it, you put your thread through the machine, it places a certain amount of tension on the thread itself, and that will become apparent when I tell you about some of the dials. The reason the machine puts tension on the thread is so that it can actually pull that thread through the machine, because obviously thread in and of itself is just, very flexible and doesn't have much strength or tension to it. So the machine has to do that. So let's start first with the top of your machine. And you have two little spindles that stick up on the top, and these are actually called spool pins, because you're going to take your spool of thread and place it on one of the pins like that, and then we'll begin our threading. So you'll see also that many of the names of the dials and the parts, or the anatomy of the sewing machine, make a lot of sense. There's a few that don't, but most of them make sense with what we're going to do. Again, this is the pin that the spool of thread goes on. So let's talk about threading the machine first. Later on we will learn how to thread, but for now just know that we're going to be talking about thread guides, because those are literally the little parts of the machine that are going to guide the thread how to go through the machine. So we're going to go from our spool pin to this first thread guide, which is on top. And on these particular machines, I love them because they're numbered. This, if you'll look at the top of your machine, says number 1, and it has an arrow that shows you that your thread is going to go through this thread guide right here and down this slot, going down inside the machine where the machine is going to put that tension on it that I talked about. Then it comes around down on the bottom here, and you'll see that there's number 2, and it's a U-turn. So that's exactly what you're going to do with your thread. You're going to take your thread, put it down through this loop right here, and back up. You're going to make that U-turn, and you're going to come back up to the top. And there is another little thread guide that, well, we'll talk about what this is in a second. This is your hand wheel, but we'll talk about that. But this one pops up and down. So you're going to take your thread, bring it up on the right-hand side, and again, number 3 up on the top here shows you that you're going to U-turn again. So take your thread, wrap it around this thread guide, and come back down your machine. Again, all of this is putting tension on that thread, so you're going to be able to sew. Bring it down to the bottom here, and guess what? Number is down here, number 4. Imagine that. Number 4 is a little tiny a hook right here where you're going to put your thread. Again, it's another thread guide. So that is basically, and I'll show you very detailed how to thread the machine, but these are all the little thread guides that are going to help you do that. Now, speaking of the tension, let's go back to where we saw that thread going through our machine. And there happens to be a little dial right here in that U-turn pathway. And guess what that's called? It's called a thread tension dial. Because this dial, depending upon how we set it, either creates more tension on the thread or less tension on the thread. So this is your thread tension dial. It should be set on number 4, is about the default setting on there. So if yours isn't on number 4, go ahead and put it on number 4. Now going over to the right, our next dial has letters on it. You can see it has A, B, C, D, all the way up to G. This is called our stitch selection dial. Sewing machines can do various stitches. They're going to do a straight stitch, which is just when you're sewing two pieces of fabric together, or it can do a zigzag stitch. It can do also some different fancy stitches. We are usually going to use A, which is your straight stitch. If you'll look on over to the far right of your sewing machine, it has a little legend here for you. And it tells you, it shows you that A is a straight stitch, B is a straight stitch, and C is a zigzag. Those are the three that we'll be using in this class. But back to this dial, you always, when you first ever sit down at your sewing machine, you want to check your dials and see where they are before you start sewing. So always make sure that if you want to do a straight stitch, that it's set on A. Here's B, and then if we want to get into zigzag, we'll go over to C. But for right now, we want it on A. So that is the variety of stitches, or the stitch selection dial. The next one that we're going to talk about is your stitch length dial. You can look right above this dial to the right, and it shows you 4 little dashes going from smaller to larger. What it's telling you is this dial is telling your needle how often to go down into your fabric. In other words, how long to make each stitch. And we change this according to different applications. But for our default setting, when we're just sewing a straight stitch, we should be on A3. And that's your best stitch length for just a regular stitch. The next lever, the next function that I want to show you on this machine is down here on the middle part of the front, and there's this fun little lever. It's got a little U-turn symbol above it, and you just press this down, and I know, go ahead and do that because I know it's fun. Just press it down, and what you're actually doing when you press this all the way down is you're making the sewing machine sew backwards. Now, why would you want to do that, you ask? When we're sewing two pieces of fabric together, it's very, very important that we lock the stitches right where we began sewing and right where we end sewing, and that's what this little guy helps us with. Because what we'll do when we begin sewing two pieces of fabric together is we'll take a few stitches forward, then we'll let this little guy help us by going backwards a few stitches, and then we'll go forward again. So what that does is it actually triple stitches in the same place, and it locks that seam together so that we can't pull it apart. You keep on sewing to the end, and you do the same thing. Let this little guy help it go backwards, and it locks it for us. Now, the next part of the sewing machine that I want to show you is over on the right hand side. It is literally on the side, and it is the hand wheel. And what you're going to do, just like the name implies, is you're going to take your hand and move the wheel. You can just rotate it either forward or backwards. I want you to do that right now, and then see what's happening to your machine. Look over at the needle and see what's happening. Just keep rotating it, and you can see what it does. It actually lowers and raises your needle. Okay? And there are times you're going to want to do that by hand and not let the machine do it. The next part of the machine that I want to show you is the area around the needle. And the first thing that you will notice is that there is a metal plate, kind of a rectangular shaped metal plate in this area, and there's all kinds of little markings on it. Those are measurements that later on we're going to talk about. That's going to help you know exactly where to put your fabric in the machine. The other thing that is real interesting on this part is this little, it's a little floppy looking little ski looking mechanism, and it is called the presser foot. What this actually does is press against the fabric as you're putting it through to hold it into place. And the way it does that is up underneath this archway here, you'll see a lever, and it lowers your presser foot, and believe it or not, it's called the presser foot lever. And that raises and lowers your presser foot up and down based upon your needs at the moment. What I'd like for you to do is go ahead and practice that for a second. What I'd like to ask for you not to do is that right there, where you just let it kind of slam down on its own. You really need to control that. If it slams down, it's very hard on the machine. It's not a good thing. So we want to always be in control when we raise and lower our presser foot. And underneath the presser foot, this is my favorite part because it has the word dog in it. You guys know that I love dogs by now. There are some little teeth underneath the presser foot on both sides that you can actually take your finger and rub against it. It's a little row of teeth and they're very rough. And this is called the feed dog. It's one of the few parts of the sewing machine that I don't really think matches what it does. I think they call it a dog, maybe because it has teeth. I have no idea. But it does feed the fabric through. So that's why they say the word feed in association with it. What I want you to do now is go back over to your hand wheel and rotate it again. And before you saw your needle go up and down, but now pay attention to your feed dog. You'll see that it rotates backwards and forwards and up and down. And that is what pulls the fabric through the machine. And there you have it. The next part of the sewing machine I want to show you is the foot pedal. And that is this piece right here, which is normally on the floor, which you have yours on the floor right now. And this piece right here, when you press on it, it makes the machine go fast or slow. It's very much like the accelerator in a car. So right now, I want you to go ahead, put your foot on it, see that it's a spring mechanism, have fun with it. So take just a minute or two to do that. Okay, that's good. You can stop now. All right, so now what I want you to do is move this completely out of the way that your foot can't touch it. So slide it under your desk somewhere that your foot can't touch it, because the next thing we're going to do is we're going to power up the machine. And I don't want you accidentally touching your foot pedal and making the machine operate when you're not ready for that yet. So right on the side of your machine, you're going to see below the hand wheel here is a little lever. And when you turn this on right here, there is light. This is where you need to be very, very careful, because once your machine is powered on, it will now activate anytime you touch your foot pedal. So let's be very, very careful about that. One last little thing I want to show you about your machine, now that you know about all the parts on it, is, and this may have already fallen off on your machine, which it does, and I think I've told you not to worry about it if it does. There is this little extension table on your machine right below the throat plate here, that when you pull it off like this, just gently pull it off to the left, you can see that right in front of your throat plate is a little door that opens up. And this is where your bobbin is going to be inserted into your machine. But that's a whole nother lesson, and we'll save that for another day. But I did want you to know, because we've talked about it, that this is where your lower thread on your machine comes from. So if you would, just go ahead and close up your little door and put your extension table back on your machine. So I have a little guest here who wants to help me review with you the things that we learned today. This is Gabriel, and he wanted me to tell you that we learned a little bit about the threading of the machine, where all the threads go in the thread guides. We learned about the different little dials on the machine, the stitch tension dial, the stitch selection dial, the stitch length dial. We learned about our reverse button. We learned about our hand wheel over here and what it does. It raises and lowers the needle, as well as it activates the feed dog, Gabriel's favorite part of the sewing machine. We learned about our throat plate and that it has measurements on it that we're going to use later. We learned about our presser foot, and that holds the fabric in place as it goes through. We also learned that if we take our little table off there, a little extension table, that this is where our bobbin is going to go later on. We'll learn how to do that. Right, Gabe? And we learned also about our foot pedal. This is what activates the whole machine and makes it go slow or fast. Have to be careful with that when the light is on, because everything will work now. So I hope you enjoyed learning about the anatomy of the sewing machine, and from me and Gabe, we'll see you next time.